As soon as night came on, she slipped out of the house and went into the woods to the spot where the linden tree stood. And after removing the leaves from the earth, she turned it up and there found him who had been murdered. Oh, how she wept and prayed that she also might die. Gladly would she have taken the body home with her, but that was impossible. So she took up the poor head with the closed eyes, kissed the cold lips, and shook the mold out of the beautiful hair. "I will keep this," said she. And as soon as she had covered the body again with the earth and leaves, she took the hat and a little sprig of jasmine that bloomed in the wood, near the spot where he was buried, and carried them home with her. As soon as she was in her room, she took the largest flower pot she could find, and in this she placed the hat of the dead man, covered it up with the earth, and planted the twig of jasmine in it. These lines, filled with the darkness of night, the horror of murder, with beheading, and elements of necrophilia, don't belong to Bram Stoker, Howard Lovecraft, or even Stephen King. Their author is the world-famous fairy tale writer from Denmark, Hans Christian Andersen. By the way, Andersen himself really didn't like being constantly called a children's writer. He claimed that he wrote his works for everyone, and probably that's why he wasn't afraid to traumatize fragile children's minds with his stories. Today we will look at his fairy tales, famous and not so famous, without Disney's rose-colored glasses, and analyze them with the fresh eyes of detectives, not just young readers. We'll discuss facts about the genius writer's life that you won't find in the children's section of bookstore. We'll also look at the very adult story behind the creation of the most popular adaptation of Andersen's fairy tale, The Little Mermaid, by Disney Studios. So, let's go! Today, Mr. Andersen would surely be very unhappy because all over the world he is known mainly as a children's writer, and his name is a synonym for magic, fairy tale fantasies, and childhood wonder. This is all because his works were adapted, animated, retold, and over time transformed into funny and touching stories. However, the original texts carry sadness, despair, ugliness, hopelessness, and frank strangeness that we tend to overlook. The writer himself admitted that his favorite fairy tale that he wrote was The Little Mermaid. Andersen didn't create the image of the mermaid. In old times, people believed that every land animal had a double underwater. After all, there were sea cows, sea horses, and sea pigs, and humans were no exception. In the Middle Ages, researchers and sea travelers often claimed mermaids or sirens existed. Most likely, they mistook beluga whales for mermaids because of the special body structure of these animals. The popularity of mermaids developed in the 19th and early 20th centuries, thanks to the spread of rumors about supposedly caught sea dwellers. Their fake mummified remains were shown for money at street shows and traveling freak exhibitions. But let's return to our story about the mermaid's love for an earthly man by Hans Christian Andersen. We all know the image of Ariel with her red hair and spirited character created by Disney Studios. This story has a happy ending which The Little Mermaid deserves. This confirms viewers' belief that love exists and good things happen to those who follow their heart's call. However, in the original plot, everything was far from that. The mermaid really saves the beautiful prince from drowning, but this rescue turns into an obsession for her, a fixation that's hard to call love. This obsession leads the mermaid to make a deal with the devil through a sea witch. The mermaid sacrifices her voice, but not painlessly. Her tongue is physically cut out, and her new legs, or two stumps, as the sea creatures call them, are graceful and beautiful, but every movement and step causes the mermaid pain, as if she is stepping on sharp knives, as if blood is flowing from her legs. And yet the little mermaid gladly goes through with this, speechless and feeling as if knife blades enter her legs morning, day and night. All this in hope of winning the prince's love. Here it's worth noting that the fairy tales texts familiar to us from childhood went through harsh censorship. Even contemporaries called Hans Christian a weirdo and moralist. He not only went to extremes in his own faith, but also made practically all his characters religious. For this reason, the pre-revolutionary Russian translation of the fairy tales was edited in some Soviet editions, so that many texts lost weight by almost half. All mentions of God, church, religion, and faith were removed from the books. Therefore, the message of some fairy tales was distorted. So in the original Little Mermaid fairy tale, the heroine goes through all the trials not only for love of the prince. Actually, the stakes are much higher. Mermaids live 300 years, but they don't have immortal souls. Humans live much less, but they have a huge advantage – eternal life in paradise. If the mermaid can make the prince fall in love with her, she'll get a human soul and be able to use the human password to enter the kingdom of heaven. The prince, on his part, just amuses himself with his foundling like a toy or pet, but that's it. The mute little mermaid is dressed sometimes in dresses, sometimes in men's riding clothes. She is literally allowed to sleep on a pillow by his door, like a house pet. What a gentleman indeed. And then her beloved meets a princess from a neighboring kingdom who looks so much like the girl who saved him. But apparently not as much like the girl who actually saved him and who slept by his door all this time. Anyway, he falls madly in love with another and proposes to her. It's interesting what the Little Mermaid wanted to tell him at that moment. A few minutes before dawn, the doomed mermaid sisters appear before her, giving her a knife from the witch and saying that if she stabs this knife into the prince's chest and lets his blood wash over her feet, they'll immediately turn back into a tail. Kill the human you love and the most bloody way possible, that's all, and the problem is solved. And so, despite her passionate love for this man, the Little Mermaid seriously considers murder. After all, if he had loved her back, she would have had eternal life. It's his own fault. And she gave him so much, endured pain, lost her tongue, not to mention saving his life. So she enters the bedroom where he is in bed with his wife and raises the knife over them. The heroine didn't go through with the murder and awaits certain death. She doesn't become foam, but she doesn't get saved either. Instead, there is a third option that for some reason wasn't mentioned before. The mermaid becomes an embodiment of wind for the next 300 years. And if she bursts into a child's room and that child is obedient and well-behaved, they'll take a year off the mermaid's punishment. However, if the child behaves badly, the mermaid cries, and with each tear, a day will be added to her existence as wind. What child wouldn't love such a fairy tale? The ending is simply delightful. Here's unrequited love, lots of pain, physical injuries, witchcraft, attempted murder, and in the end, an incredibly long and hard punishment for nothing. The moral: if you're a good child, you're a small part of freeing this poor little mermaid from the centuries of suffering. However, if you're bad, you're extending her already lengthy torment. After everything this poor thing went through, don't you just want to eat your portion of oatmeal and go to bed early without arguing to let her get to paradise? In The Little Mermaid, the heroine who gave everything got absolutely nothing for her sacrifices. A loving mother, a tiny girl, and a grand adventure. There is no kindness in the creatures that Thumbelina meets on her path. The girl passes from hand to hand with amazing carelessness. From a big ugly toad and the prospect of marrying her son, she ends up with a field mouse who first takes the unknown girl to her home, but then sells her to her old rich friend. She no longer worries about her welfare or future. Thumbelina has no voice in this matter and just often cries. Realizing the horror of her existence, the little girl finds comfort in trying to save and heal a bird that everyone thought was dead. The bird comes to life, recovers on the wedding day with a mole, and at the last minute saves Thumbelina. The fairy tale has a brilliant setup. A childless woman in search of a child, but the plot moves away from this question so quickly that it seems almost unfair. This poor woman was ready to resort to witchcraft to get a baby, and instead of giving birth to an infant, she had to grow a tiny girl from a seed in a flower pot. But the woman loves her anyway. Her love, acceptance, and care are nothing more than background in the big story about Thumbelina. Even the child herself doesn't feel sad about her mother after the separation, doesn't remember her, and goes to live with her own kind. Getting married as a child seems to be the only possible outcome of Thumbelina's story. First, the toad tries to marry her off, then the field mouse, and finally Andersen himself. You might think that the bird would return the child to her mother, since she's still a little girl after all. Instead, Andersen marries her off to a little-known character, a flower elf living in a bud. The secret of Thumbelina's marriage happiness with the tiny prince is that he is her size and her biological species. What more could you want? In general, it's a very creepy story about an underage bride who has no right to choose or influence her life, indifferent adults, talking animals, tiny people, and a witch. Even the title sounds life-affirming. He is made of metal, but that doesn't stop him from being noble and full of love. And the element of having only one leg, and here's almost a body-positive story. It's surprising that Disney didn't make a separate masterpiece, although the story was included in the Fantasia 2000 cartoon. The generally accepted and familiar adaptation of this fairy tale is another case where love, truth, and valor triumph. In Andersen's original fairy tale, the same dark forces win. Let's start with the fact that the tin soldier is a brother in a squad of soldiers just like him, but he has only one leg. This makes part of his title Steadfast a bit ironic, sad. But hold on, it gets even sadder. The object of his attachment is a ballerina living in a paper castle on the other side of the nursery. He sits on the window's wheel and watches her from afar. From his point of view, she also has only one leg, which means they have so much in common. Of course, she has two, but he can only see one because she's frozen in a dance pose. This shows a childish and heartbreaking need for someone similar with the same flaw as himself. Naturally, there's also an enemy, a troll who plots a strange journey of the soldier. And when, after all the adventures, it seems that a happy ending is about to come, both the soldier and the ballerina end up in a stove, where they both burn. It feels like there is no moral here, just a lot of undeserved pain and suffering. The soldier was born imperfect and loved another with wild passion, whom he considered equally imperfect, languishing in search of comfort and closeness. For reasons beyond their control, the couple meets premature death, and what's left of them is only meaningful because it reflects the worthlessness of their existence. In the morning, the servant discovers that the soldier's sting has turned into a heart, and the ballerina left behind a sick queen that's covered with soot. After the ballerina, there remained stained beauty, and after the soldier, the physical embodiment of his only feeling, love. This fairy tale focuses on authenticity testing. The prince in this story isn't looking for love, but for a real princess, and although there are holders of this title, he finds something wrong in each of them. The story doesn't specify what's missing, but he remains a bachelor until a girl wet from a rain appears on his doorstep in the middle of the night looking for a place to sleep. The stranger claims she is a real princess, though she can't prove it. The queen, the prince's mother, has doubts about this, but she arranges a reliable test. We all know what it involved. Of course, it's a fairy tale, but it's funny to imagine that the princess arrives in the middle of the night at a stranger's house and agrees without question to sleep on a stack of mattresses. Nothing embarrasses her, and she climbs, presumably up a ladder, to sleep in this tower of bedding. In the morning, instead of being grateful for the hospitality, the princess complains and focuses only on how uncomfortable her bed was. The queen and prince rejoice at her dissatisfaction because the princess is real, then lavish wedding, happy ending. Typical royal family logic. Everything's in order. It's interesting that in searching for his betrothed, the prince is guided by intuition that suggests all sorts of absurdities, like the idea that his heart's chosen one is one who can't sleep on a pea. There's concern about the prince's health. Undoubtedly, pebbles on the street under her shoe soles should compete with the pain that the poor mermaid experienced. Andersen most likely pushes readers to conclude, believing that royalty are physically too sensitive and delicate for normal life is as ridiculous as choosing a wife based on a strange girl's inability to sleep comfortably on 20 mattresses. Everyone who thought Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales were only for children should read this masterpiece. It tells of a prince who gets into the Garden of Eden and meets the insanely beautiful fairy queen. She tells him he can stay and live with her in paradise for the next 100 years under one condition. He must resist the desire to kiss her every night while he is there. Unfortunately, he didn't last long, as the fairy queen seduced the naive prince on the very first night. She undressed completely and lay down before him. Unable to resist, the prince kissed her, which plunged Eden into the earth's core and doomed the unfortunate man to eternal life wandering the earth to atone for his sins. Perhaps it's already a parable. The moral and message to young people is obvious: adultery leads to no good. The evil prince is a power-hungry maniac who wages war against all other kingdoms on earth. His armies kill everyone in their path, even women and children. When he conquered all kingdoms on earth, he decided to conquer heaven too, preparing an army and airships. However, the world is saved by a swarm of mosquitoes. They attack the prince's army, one flies into his ear and stings him there. The poison drives the cruel prince mad, and before he starts dancing before his troops, he strips naked. In general, the evil prince was defeated by a lonely hero mosquito. As with reading many of Hans Christian Andersen's stories, the question involuntarily arises whether he was quite sane when he wrote this. A story that's both a bit confusing and scary is The Shadow. Remember it next time you see your own shadow following you everywhere on a nice sunny day. In the story, a young man parts with his shadow, which begins to live its own life. The shadow just leaves and a new one appears instead. So the guy forgets about it until one day a stranger appears claiming to be his old shadow. The shadow tells what all this time he lived the life of an ordinary person in the real world, accumulated a huge fortune by blackmailing people with these secrets he learned by peeping into their windows. The shadow lures the young man to follow him, and the real young man actually becomes the shadow of his shadow, following it everywhere. Eventually, the shadow takes the young man's place and executes him. One of Andersen's most eerie, dark and gothic fairy tales is The Traveling Companion. It all starts when one night a guy named John is walking through a cemetery and runs into two robbers. They say they are desecrating the grave of a man who owed them a lot of money before he died. John gives them all his coins to leave the deceased alone. The next day, the main character encounters a new mysterious traveling companion, with whom many adventures await him. Once they meet a beautiful princess whom John falls in love with. The problem is that she's also a psychopath who kills her suitors if they don't tell her what she's thinking within 3 days. Anyway, there's a lot of blood and violence. The stranger helps John survive and outwit the maniac, and then it turns out that this benefactor is the ghost of the corpse whose grave was initially desecrated. He cared for John as gratitude and disappeared when John began to live happily with the now sane princess. The fairy tale we started this story with is The Elf of the Rose Bush. Don't try to visualize what's happening. A tiny elf living in rose buds witnessed a terrible crime. A man killed a beautiful young man, then cut off his head and buried it along with the torso. This was the brother of the girl with whom the young man had a love relationship. The elf told the young beauty about this. As soon as night came, the girl quietly left the house, went to the grove, dug up the earth, and found the murdered man. The beauty took the severed head and, coming home, found the biggest flower pot, put the head there, covered it with earth and planted a flower there. So the hat in the pot remained in the pot on the window's wheel of her bedroom. In the finale, just retribution caught up with the girl's evil brother. However, it's incomprehensible how the young girl calmly lived in a room where she kept the head of a dead person, even if it was her beloved. It's noticeable that Andersen had a special relationship with roses. They often appear in his fairy tales. In childhood, Andersen had no friends and teachers scolded him. The boy found no understanding anywhere until one day a girl named Sarah gave him a white rose. Andersen remembered this incident for the rest of his life. Since then, the white rose for the writer was a symbol of miracle, beauty, and happiness. In Hans Christian Andersen's literary legacy, there are many more eerie, dark, and simply strange fairy tales. It's not hard to guess that a person with such a rich imagination had a difficult childhood and life. Andersen is a controversial, eccentric, and not fully understood personality. Contemporaries described him as a child completely selfish, innocently vain, the center of whose life, interests, concerns, and meaning was himself. Andersen really needed enormous egoism to rise from the harsh circumstances of his early years and turn his pain into art. There is evidence that he placed his characters in desperate and hopeless situations to reflect his personal traumas, such as poverty, the loss of his father, and the need to work briefly at a factory as a child to feed his mother. The Ugly Duckling reflects Andersen's own sense of alienation, which he himself admitted. In childhood, he was teased for his appearance. He was very tall and thin and also spoke in a high voice. In his fairy tales, you can often see the thirst for transformation into something else and better. Like the Ugly Duckling, Andersen grew up and became a famous, successful writer and wealthy man. However, even contemporaries noted that he had disproportionately large hands and feet, a long nose, and small eyes. A good-natured smile changed the impression of him for the better, but even despite this, many Danes called Andersen our foreign gorilla. Amazingly, Andersen suffered from dyslexia but learned to read. However, he had problems with spelling all his life and his handwritten texts were full of errors. Publishers fortunately corrected everything. They only left his lively, figurative language and storytelling manner untouched. The future writer's father, a shoemaker and somewhat self-taught, was the son of a local madhouse resident and was not entirely mentally stable himself. The woodcarver in the town of Odense was considered crazy because a significant part of his wooden crafts consisted of strange half-animal, half-human figures. Hans Christian was close to his father but lost him at age 11. Andersen's mother, who was older than his father and illiterate, had a daughter by a married man 6 years older than Hans Christian. His aunt ran a brothel in Copenhagen, and his half-sister almost certainly worked as a prostitute for several years. Andersen was haunted by these immoral relationships. He came to view his mother's family as a model of debauchery and feared that this vice would break through into his carefully arranged life. Therefore, already in his youth, in his diaries, Hans Christian rejected the idea of carnal love and he never had sexual relations. Throughout his life, Andersen fell in love with several women and possibly several men too, if we believe some letters he wrote to young men. But each time his feelings were not returned. As a young man, Andersen lived with a family whose son was named Edward Collin. Edward took care of Andersen's business matters, but he was very proud and looked down on the sensitive writer. Young Hans Christian adored Edward, whether romantically or not, but he expected love back from this smart, successful, but cold and formal man. This wasn't in Edward's nature and it deeply hurt Andersen, making him think he could never build a relationship with anyone. It seems like Andersen, just like his characters the Little Mermaid or Gerda in The Snow Queen, chose to love people who would never love him back. For example, he fell for opera singer Jenny Lind, to whom he even dedicated his fairy tale The Nightingale. Andersen never married, and people of his time call him a platonic lover because he never experienced physical love. Even though Andersen is considered pure and chaste, possibly asexual, he still had natural desires. In his diaries, he wrote very openly about acts of self-pleasure, marking different numbers of plus and minus signs depending on how often and how successful they were. What's surprising, if not touching, is how Andersen described his first visit to a Paris brothel at age 61, August 30, 1866. During the whole trip, I felt drawn to visit a prostitute. No matter how tired I was, I decided to see one of them. I came to the house. A woman came who sold human flesh. 4 prostitutes appeared. They said the youngest was 18. I told her to stay, and she wore hardly anything except a shirt, and I felt so sorry for her. I paid the madam 5 francs, gave her the girl 5 francs when she asked, but did nothing, just looked at this poor child who completely undressed herself and looked so confused that I could barely look at her. Then there was another visit, which he described like this: May 1867. After dinner, I walked back and forth in lust. Then suddenly decided to go to a public house. One was plastered with powder, the second was boring, the third was almost a lady. I spoke with her, paid 12 francs and left, not really sinning, but definitely sinning in thoughts. She asked me to come again, said I was very innocent for a gentleman. Andersen traveled a lot. In his lifetime, he took 29 long trips and countless short ones. It's amazing how he handled the hardships of travel while suffering from so many phobias. Andersen was afraid of literally everything: being robbed, losing documents, scratches and other injuries to his body. He had taphophobia. He was afraid of being accidentally declared dead and buried alive. That's why every night before bed he left a note that said, "I only appear to be dead." And he made sure that before his death someone would cut his artery. The fairy tale writer was terribly afraid of dogs. Even a small dog caused him panic. Andersen didn't eat pork because he was afraid of getting trichinosis, a parasite found in pigs. During his travels, he always carried a long rope in his luggage. Why? In case of fire, he could climb down the rope from a window. Very thoughtful. The fairy tale writer was also afraid of being poisoned. Once, Hans Christian received a huge box of chocolate candies as a gift from Danish children, the biggest in the world, as the gift giver said. But he was afraid that fans wanted to poison him and gave the sweet gift to his nieces. However, after making sure the candies were safe to eat, the writer took them back. The famous fairy tale writer had a strange relationship with teeth. Andersen often had toothaches, was very superstitious about them, and believed that his writing talent depended on how many teeth he had. Andersen spent at most 2 days writing one fairy tale. When he was creating another story, he would half close his eyes, and because of this squinting, people around him thought he had bad eyesight. The writer had amazing visual imagination, which is proven by the sketches he made during his travels and his other hobby, or rather obsession, with paper. The fairy tale writer had a real passion for paper. Andersen wrote on it, drew on it, and cut it. Wherever he went, he always had a bag stuffed with paper and huge scissors with which he cut one elegant figures. Often to entertain his friends and their children, Andersen would tell fantastic stories while cutting paper and end his tale by unfolding the cut-out pictures in front of amazed listeners. The cutouts were not only beautiful but also contained the secret of the story, designed to challenge the mind. Andersen's relationships with other people were also unusual. The fact that he had a bad character is shown by the story of his friendship with another great writer. Andersen met his literary idol, Charles Dickens, at an aristocratic party in 1847, and both writers were thrilled with each other. But not for long. Some of the Danish fairy tales had just been translated into English, and Andersen went on what we would now call a promotional tour. After returning to Denmark, Andersen, known for his awkwardness in communication, seemed to become a bit obsessed with the English writer. For 9 years, he regularly sent him fan letters along with books for review. Dickens, in return, politely invited Andersen to visit him. The Dane came to the British writer's house in Kent, England, in July 1857, and it was terrible timing. Dickens was thinking about leaving his wife. Since his invitation, which was probably just polite, time had passed and everything in his life had changed and become complicated. His adaptation of Little Dorrit was not successful, and Dickens was also frantically rehearsing his role in a theater play. The Danish visitor's stay was supposed to last no more than 2 weeks. They say guests like fish go bad after 3 days, and Andersen, to the horror of the Dickens family, instead of 2 weeks, stayed for 5. On his first morning as a guest, Andersen announced that, according to Danish custom, one of the sons in the house should shave their guest. The family refused to go along with his crazy ideas and sent Andersen to a local barber. He couldn't pronounce the name of his book, The Improviser, in Italian. He doesn't speak any languages except Danish, though there are suspicions that he doesn't really master that one either. Dickens joked about his guest. Andersen constantly complained that the house was cold and drove the Dickens family crazy with his tantrums. Once, after reading a particularly bad review of one of his books, he threw himself face down on the lawn and cried for a long time. He literally annoyed the entire Dickens family so much that when Andersen finally left, the English writer left a note. Hence, Andersen slept in this room for 5 weeks, and to the family they seemed like ages. 6 days later, the author wrote to his friend complaining about Andersen's strange behavior. Every time he came to London, he got into a wild confusion of cabs and sherry and seemed unable to get out of either. And when he returned here, he cut all sorts of patterns from paper and collected very strange little bouquets of flowers in a forest. The visit ended their friendship. Dickens stopped answering Andersen's letters, and should we be surprised after this that Andersen wrote such sad fairy tales? But their short relationship might not have been completely fruitless. The boring old bore, as Dickens' daughter put it, inspired the writer to create a sycophantic character in David Copperfield. Of course, it might seem to us that Andersen's original fairy tales weren't meant for children, but we need to remember 2 things. First, the attitude toward children in the 19th century was very different from today. And second, Andersen lived and worked at a time when, after Napoleon's defeat, the Danes turned their attention to literature, art, and theater. Despite all his folk roots and naivety, he saw himself at the forefront of literature and was just as enthusiastic about technical experiments and innovation in art as he was about technical progress in society. So his unusual fairy tales, dark on the edge of mysticism and religion, were nothing other than a new type of this literary genre. His fairy tales seemed very adult to children, and that made them so exciting and interesting. Researchers found Andersen's first fairy tale in his school notes, but he began publishing his works after age 30, and it took him 10 years to become popular. Andersen became famous during his lifetime with all the consequences that followed. He asked composer Hartmann to write a funeral march for his funeral that sounded like a children's song. He assumed that many children would come to his funeral and this would be appropriate. Perhaps he missed the fact that funerals are sad events and the children who would come to say goodbye to him would be sad and cry, but under a cheerful march. The writer also wished that there would be no children on the monument built in his honor. He was a bit afraid of children. The monument was built in Copenhagen, and it shows Hans Christian Andersen sitting alone with an open book. Just as he went through his life alone, he died alone, surrounded only by his fantasies, printed books and paper cutouts. Some modern scientists believe that the great fairy tale writer suffered from a form of high-functioning autism, now known as Asperger's syndrome. This idea comes from his difficulties in social communication, narrow interests, repetitive rituals, language and speech peculiarities, problems with nonverbal communication, motor clumsiness, and many other features that his contemporaries considered just eccentricities. The paradox of Andersen's legacy is that his fairy tales gave millions of children a fantastic world filled with princes and princesses, mermaids, witches and elves, talking animals and living objects. In this world, there is an endless battle between good and evil that leaves no one indifferent. But in his fairy tales, nothing good is rewarded, and pain sometimes remains just personal experience and nothing more. People are heartless, love is meaningless, and everyone suffers. The author seems just as puzzled by life as we are and expresses this by subjecting his characters to early and meaningless death and their souls to eternal suffering. If you're feeling really sad about the story of a real Little Mermaid and the life story of her author, here are some of the most famous and most discussed Disney silliness related to its screen adaptation. Undoubtedly, they would have horrified the chaste fairy tale writer. The Little Mermaid, produced by Walt Disney Feature Animation, is an American animated fantasy film that came out in 1989. Let's look at the poster of this wonderful cartoon. What's so indecent about it? Don't you notice anything? Let's look a little closer, and now even closer. Okay, anyone can see things? Disney approved the poster, but when children all over the world started bringing home videotapes with this work of art on the cover, parents spotted a phallic image in King Tritoon's castle, whether it was there or not. If you search for Little Mermaid posters online today, you can see the studio's attempts to hide the ambiguous element. The legend goes like this: a disgruntled artist working on the cartoon was fired, but before leaving, he got revenge by drawing a male sex organ on the poster. Disney claims that the unusually shaped castle tower was not the result of an angry former employee. It's just a coincidence. Another coincidence is related to the wedding scene of the mermaid and prince. The happiest person at the ceremony appears to be the priest marrying the couple. So happy that some viewers spotted the erection. Angry parents demanded the episode be removed from the cartoon. But the studio responded that it was the church minister's sneeze, and judging by the fact that the element soon doubles, it really is sneeze. But it came out awkwardly. Whether these are not coincidences or not, you can decide after learning the life story of the Little Mermaid's creator. Screenwriter, producer, and lyricist Howard Ashman agreed to sign a contract with Disney on the condition that he would have full creative control and freedom in the process of working on the cartoon. And he brought with him his longtime Broadway colleague, composer Alan Menken. Ashman, a gay man in 1980s America, had great personal experience leading cultural wars between family values and gay rights. At that time, Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, and his policies were unfriendly toward gays due to the sudden outbreak of the HIV and AIDS epidemic. Ashman saw an opportunity to promote his social message and taboo topics through a family viewing film. Ashman's Little Mermaid is a bold film about gender and identity. The central story of The Little Mermaid is, of course, the identity crisis of 16-year-old Ariel. For most of the cartoon, we watch the main character with an unusually open body, her hair styled like Southern California fashionistas. She feels constrained by patriarchal underwater society and feels she doesn't belong to it. Ariel longs for another world, different from her own, where she could become free from the restrictions of her rigid culture and conservative family. Her body is underwater, but her heart and mind are on land with humans. She leads a double life. When Ariel decides to tell her friends and family about her secret identity, here we see an analogy with the coming-out process. They punish her and convince her that she should accept her fate. She must meet her father Triton's expectations, sink when told, and give up all hopes for another life. In her suffering, Ariel runs to the sea with Ursula, the only strong woman in the entire film, and thus Ariel's only role model. Ashman's image of Ursula was inspired by Divine, the stage name of Harris Glenn Milstead, an American actor, singer, and drag queen. Ursula's song Poor Unfortunate Souls is essentially a drag show in which the naive mermaid is instructed on how to attract Prince Eric. Teaching young Ariel how to get her man, Ursula applies makeup, enlarges her hips and shoulders, and puts on accessories, all standard transformation techniques. The general message: being a woman in a man's world means putting on a show. Ariel must learn that gender is not something taken for granted, but something that can be organized with external elements. This is a powerful message for young girls and boys, deeply threatening to King Triton and Ronald Reagan. Ashman encoded in his creative work. Ursula represents feminism, gender fluidity, and the empowerment of young Ariel. Nevertheless, most reviewers didn't notice the film's culturally subversive ideas, though they acknowledged that Ariel was unique. Ashman and Menken received their Oscars. What Disney didn't notice or know was that during the filming of The Little Mermaid in 1988, in the middle of work on the cartoon, Ashman was diagnosed with a fairly advanced stage of AIDS. Ashman himself hid his illness. "A person with AIDS creates children's cartoons. I was afraid I would be fired." After a full work day, he returned to his home hospital. During the Little Mermaid press conference at Disneyland, he was already walking with a catheter in the chest, and his health was getting worse. But the studio didn't want to lose a valuable employee. Howard Ashman still completed work on Beauty and Beast and even wrote several songs and visual ideas for Aladdin. He died at age 40 and didn't see their release. And yet, it's undeniable that without Ashman, there wouldn't have been these Disney hits and such beloved sensations and buzz that he and his Little Mermaid caused. Boo.